now finally ready for the last lesson in Chapter 9. We know who the classical economists are. We know what their basic beliefs are. We've seen their assumptions, and we have learned about Say's law. Say's law is important for what we're about to cover here, because Say's law suggests that production is what is most important about the economy. So when you see these graphs, you're going to notice they seem to really be ignoring aggregate demand. And they're ignoring it because they believe it's not really that important, that ultimately it's production that drives the economy. So what we're going to be trying to do today is explain how the economy fixes itself. And remember that the classical economists believe that the government didn't need to get involved with the macroeconomy, and that's what you're going to see here. You're going to see why the economy may fix itself according to classical economists, and that's why they believe the government doesn't have to get involved. So if you recall, we talked early on, I believe the first part of this chapter, about the three states of the economy: recessionary gaps, inflationary gaps, and long-run equilibrium. So what we need to do is figure out how these gaps are going to move towards a long-run equilibrium. So let's start with, firstly, dealing with a recessionary gap. If you're taking notes, give yourself a lot of room to try to write all of this down. This is super important. Definitely will be tested on this. So if you recall, a recessionary gap looks like this. Here's our real GDP, and here's our CPI, okay? Tying a lot of stuff back together that we've learned in this class. We figured out how to solve for GDP and real GDP and where CPI comes from. Then in Chapter 8, we explained why short and aggregate supply and aggregate demand are shaped the way they are. And then in Chapter 9, we're applying those concepts. So the first thing I always do when I draw these graphs is I first start out by showing the short-run equilibrium, which is the assumption that we tend to make. The economy usually is at equilibrium, which means that the CPI and the real GDP are at equilibrium. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that the economy is good. Just because it's at equilibrium, that doesn't mean it's living up to its full potential. And in fact, in this case, it certainly isn't. So here's our real GDP, here's our CPI. That shows reality. And then the long-run aggregate supply curve shows this economy's potential production. Okay? So currently this economy is producing and consuming at this level, but it has the ability to produce at the natural real GDP. Okay? So fixing this gap. Okay, and I'm gonna explain this using steps. And the reason I'm going to use steps is because I want you guys to realize how each concept basically explains what's going to happen next. There's a very logical analysis that the classical economists followed based on reason, based on critical thinking. So let's first, in step one, just show where we're at. Currently, the real GDP is less than the natural real GDP, indicating a weak economy. Specifically, an economy producing below its full potential. Okay? So this economy is certainly producing below its potential. And if it's producing below its potential, we also know about the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate must be greater than 4.5%. In other words, there must be some cyclical unemployment, some unemployment that is a result of a bad economy. This all makes sense so far, I believe. The economy, for whatever reason, okay, we're just choosing this starting point and saying, let's imagine we're in a recessionary gap. If we're in a recessionary gap, that means real GDP is less than the natural. Means we're producing less than our potential. And why are we producing less than our potential? Well, it's hard to say, but we know that the unemployment rate has to be more than 4.5%. So that's a really good place to look for clues. If we're trying to figure out why this economy is struggling, we might look at this labor market here, okay? So the unemployment rate is more than 4.5%, meaning there is some cyclical unemployment. And let's think what would happen next, okay? Let's think about what happens when something is readily available. Right now, there's lots of labor. If I want to hire some labor, there's a lot of workers out there for me to hire right now, okay? So there are lots of available workers. Right? There are lots of available workers, okay? There are more people unemployed than there should be because the economy is so bad. These are not workers that are incapable or unemployed because of the fact that they happen to be working for a bad business temporarily. Cyclical unemployment is unemployment because of a bad economy. So this is unemployment that doesn't have to occur. It's avoidable, okay? So it's pretty easy to hire these workers up. These are good, capable workers that are available. So there are lots of available workers. And since there are so many workers, since there is so much labor available, wages drop. Wages decrease. And you should be able to explain why they decrease. They decrease because anytime there's a lot of something available, it gets cheap. Okay? For example, imagine, let's think of a good example. Imagine that there is only one house for sale in Atlanta. It's the only house. Everything else is sold, it's done, nobody else wants to sell. There's just one house for sale in Atlanta. What kind of price could you expect would happen for that house if it goes for sale? It's probably going to sell for a really high price, right? Because there's only one house available. Now imagine instead that there are thousands, tens of thousands of houses, maybe even hundreds of thousands of houses available for sale in Atlanta. Well, if that happens, then you can imagine that's going to make the price a lot cheaper on those houses. It's really just basic law of demand, right? When the quantity is low, thinking about this kind of backwards from the way we usually think about it, but when the quantity is really low, the price is usually really high. And when the quantity is really high, the price is usually really low, okay? So what we have right now is, rather than just the market for housing, we've got the market for workers, quantity of labor and wage, and we have so many workers available that the labor demand is going to be able to hire those workers at low wages, okay? So since there is so much labor available, wages drop. I explained it there, thinking about it graphically. If we think about this the way this would look in the real world, the workers are desperate. So they accept less. They know it's hard to find a job, right? They're looking around at their friends that are unemployed too, and they know it's hard to find a job, so they're willing to now work for less than they would before. And even those that are working, they may be willing to take a pay cut. You know, if your boss tells you, look, we're going to have to pay you $2 less an hour because the economy is bad, you're probably going to accept that because you know that if you leave that job, there's not many options out there for you. So this is not a time to try to negotiate for a salary raise. This is the time to accept a salary cut. So workers are desperate, so they accept less. And thinking about it from the businesses know workers are easy to find, so they lower their wages. Now this may take time, okay? It may take time for these wages to drop because, wages aren't necessarily flexible. We talked about sticky wages, right? Back in chapter 8. So it may take a while, okay? This process, this step number 2, may take a little time to occur. Maybe it takes 6 months, right? For this to really adjust entirely. But eventually these wages are going to drop. So let's think about what happens. After wages drop, as they're dropping, what does that incentivize? what do you do when something becomes cheaper? You buy more of it. And businesses are the same way. When wages go down, businesses now are willing to hire more workers. So since wages are dropping, businesses hire more workers. Okay? Anytime something becomes cheaper, ceteris paribus, you're going to buy more of it. So the economy was struggling before, but it hasn't gotten any worse or better, but the labor's cheaper. So you hire more labor, even though the economy's bad, simply because the labor's cheaper. This is a good thing for the businesses. You definitely don't want to hire less, right? If the businesses are paid less, that doesn't mean you want to, or excuse me, if the workers are cheaper, you certainly wouldn't want to buy less workers. You would probably want to buy more, right? Because they're cheaper. So they hire more workers. Now, what does that do to the businesses if they hire more workers? They'll be able to produce more, okay? So with more workers, businesses can now increase production. It's a simple idea. If you have more factors of production, right? If you have more resources, you can produce more. So in this case, they have more resources because they have more labor. So they're able to produce more. And then that's going to affect our graph over here, okay? Specifically, that causes the short-run aggregate supply curve to increase. Now let's think about why it's short-run aggregate supply. Why not long-run aggregate supply? Well, long-run aggregate supply shows our potential production. Natural real GDP is the production if the unemployment rate is at 4.5%, okay? It's the theoretical ability of where our potential is. Our potential production hasn't changed, okay? I haven't said we've gotten better at producing. I haven't said we've gotten worse at producing. I've only said that we're going to hire more workers. That doesn't change our potential, does it? Okay? It's kind of like saying that I was working 6 hours a week and now I'm working 8 hours a week. How does that affect my potential production? It doesn't affect my potential production. My potential is my potential, okay? It just affects how much I'm producing that day. So same thing here. When we hire more labor, that doesn't affect our potential production. It affects our actual production in the short run. So the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift, okay? And I'm going to draw this so it shifts to the perfect amount the first time. It's kind of hard to explain what I mean by that until you see it. But let's draw it so that short run aggregate supply crosses right here so that all three of these curves meet at the same point. Okay? So short run aggregate supply increases. And there's only one more thing that really needs to happen for this economy to fully adjust. Okay? And that's that CPI must drop. Remember, one of our assumptions of the classical model was that prices must be flexible. So if that assumption is going to hold, which we're calling it an assumption, right? So it must, if we're taking that literally, then the CPI must drop to account for this change in the short run aggregate supply curve. So we get a new CPI that allows for production to rise. Okay. So production rises. Right? Notice I'm not saying consumption necessarily rises. I'm focusing on the production side of things. All right, because that's what shifted here. So production rises, and maybe consumption ends up rising too with it. Production rises, and now real GDP equals natural real GDP. The economy is at its long-run equilibrium. And this kind of explains why we call it a long-run equilibrium. The classical economists believed that if the economy was allowed to be put in a test tube, or that was stuck in a snow globe, that the economy would always eventually reach the long-run equilibrium. It would always eventually reach the point where the real GDP and the natural real GDP are the same. Okay, and to be clear, that's the end result. The real GDP rises, and we end up with a real GDP that's exactly equal to the natural real GDP. Now the unemployment rate's 4.5%. Okay? Now there's no cyclical unemployment. Now there's no reason for wages to need to adjust anymore. Once the unemployment rate reaches 4.5%, this effect that we have here where wages are dropping is going to stop. And now we're going to reach a long-run equilibrium where there's really nothing to make the economy change at this point. Okay? So let's take all of this in real quick. Let's just run back through it one time. We started out with a recessionary gap where the economy is producing less than its potential. We have high unemployment. Because of the high unemployment, wages drop. There's so many workers available that they realize they got to work for less. The businesses know there's lots of workers available, so they start paying their workers less as well. And so wages drop. When wages drop, businesses hire more workers. With more workers, they can now produce more. That causes short-run aggregate supply to increase. Very last thing that needs to happen is the CPI needs to drop to allow for us to reach this new equilibrium. And at that new equilibrium, the real GDP is now equal to the natural real GDP. Okay? A couple of notes to make sure you understand this. Remember, long-run aggregate supply, that shows us potential production. That hasn't changed. Okay? Our potential hasn't been changed. Your potential production is changed by things like, the resources getting better or worse. So, for example, if let's say we had a horrible war and 3 million workers died, well, that would affect our potential. Okay? Here, we don't have that sort of thing happening. We just have resources being moved around, labor re-entering the labor force, which is a short-run issue. Another thing I want to definitely point out here is you note the aggregate demand. We didn't talk about it at all. And you may be tempted to look at this and say, wages are dropping. Why doesn't that affect aggregate demand? If people are making less money, wouldn't that affect aggregate demand? Well, the short answer to that question is the classical economists don't care. Production creates consumption, right? They believed in Say's law. They believed that when people earn money, it ends up getting spent. So ultimately, the earning and the production tied to that earning is what matters. And that's why they're focusing on the short-run production. Okay? That's the short answer. The long answer is aggregate demand in reality probably could be affected, and the classical economists didn't really care to think about that because, for one, they believed in Say's law, and two, this is a bit more complicated than meets the eye. Demand is based on a lot of things, wages just being one of them, and wages may not be enough to cause aggregate demand to change, okay? Frankly, I think aggregate demand probably does get affected a bit by changes in wages, but I'm not a classical economist, okay? And right now what I'm teaching you is classical economics. So they believed the recessionary gap would fix itself based on these reasons now, and so recessionary gaps are a problem. They do exist, but they're a short-run problem that the government doesn't have to try to fix. So the classical economists would not recommend the government trying to go in and create stimulus packages and stuff to fix this recessionary gap. They would just leave it alone. Okay, so that's a recessionary gap. Let's now look at an inflationary gap. The good thing is if you can do the recessionary gap and you understand that, then the inflationary gap becomes a lot easier. A lot of times when I'm teaching this in class, I actually have my students solve this for me. They're usually able to figure this out on their own simply by kind of going and looking at what you did with the recessionary gap and kind of doing the same sort of thing but with a different starting point, okay? You'll see what I mean. An inflationary gap looks like this. Okay, so notice I'm going to start out by drawing this exactly the same way as I did with the recessionary gap, meaning I'm going to start at the short-run equilibrium. So here's my CPI at equilibrium. Here is my real GDP at equilibrium. Okay, so that's my starting point. And then if we're in an inflationary gap, it must be the case that we're producing more than our long-run potential. So here's our natural real GDP here. All right, and if this is confusing to you, that this economy is producing more than its potential, go back and check out the first video in Chapter 9 where we explain why this matters and why it's important. And remember, the problem with an inflationary gap, we believe now, is that it creates bad investments. That when the economy is this good people will do things like borrow money for a house, assuming the economy will stay that strong. And once the economy goes back to normal, they will no longer be able to afford their housing payments, and they end up losing their house. So when the economy is really good, the problem is it causes people to make investments that end up being bad deals once the economy goes back to normal. A lot of times inflationary gaps lead to recessionary gaps. That's the current wisdom. That's what we pretty much know today in economics can occur. Classical economists weren't that concerned with inflationary gaps because they figured they'd be short-lived and they'd fix themselves. No big deal. So here's how they figured it would fix itself. So here are those steps, all right? And you'll see a lot of similarities. It's almost like a mirror image to what we just did. Starting out, the real GDP in this example is greater than the natural real GDP. This economy is producing beyond its sustainable potential. All right? This can't last. It's beyond its sustainable potential. And then the unemployment rate is where? If the economy is producing beyond its potential, then the unemployment rate would have to be less than 4.5%. All right? What this means is there's negative cyclical unemployment. There are people who are not unemployed who in a typical economy would be. Okay, this is problematic because remember, unemployment is healthy. 4.5% unemployment is healthy because unemployment allows for people whose skills aren't useful anymore to get pushed out of the labor market. So they go try to find new skills. It allows for businesses that are doing poorly to fail, causing some unemployment. But with the economy this strong, there's going to be businesses that probably should fail that are able to stay alive temporarily. The problem there is they end up making bad investments, expanding their business, and when the economy goes back to normal, their entire business fails, okay? And so they're worse off than they were before. So unemployment rate is below 4.5%. And so let's think about what that would do. There are few available workers. All right, there are few available workers, and the ones that are available tend to be flawed in some way. We've eliminated all the cyclical unemployment, and we're probably eliminating a good portion of the frictional unemployment too. So a lot of the unemployment that's left is just the structural. These are people you don't really want to hire. Okay, so this is a great place to be in if you're a worker, at least temporarily here. If you're an unemployed worker, this is a good scenario for you. There are very few available workers, so because labor is so scarce, wages rise. Okay? Thinking about this from either the businesses or the individual workers' perspectives. From the workers' perspective, they know they're scarce, okay? All right, so I'm trying to figure out a good way to word this. They know there aren't any workers available. And so how do you take advantage of that information? Well, you don't accept a low wage, right? If you're an unemployed worker, you don't accept a low wage, you wait for a higher one. Another way to take advantage of this is to ask for a raise. This is a really good time to ask for a raise. If you're ever in the future, thinking about asking for a raise, this would be the perfect time to do it. Because the businesses know it's going to be hard to replace you. And furthermore, you know that if you leave the job, you can probably find another one elsewhere. So that makes your desire to get a raise more credible. So if I go to my boss and say, increase my wage by 12%, they're going to believe that you really will leave unless you get that raise because they know that the economy is strong enough that you'll be able to find work elsewhere. Okay? There aren't many workers available, so, ask for raises. Ask for raises, hold out for more money, etc. Okay? From the business's perspective, they simply they can't hire anyone without increasing wages. What this looks like is I post a job, maybe in the newspaper or online or something, and I say, I'm trying to hire a recent Georgia College grad, and I'm offering to pay them $45,000, and no one applies. Okay, or maybe one person applies, but they suck, right? They're not any good. They're the structurally unemployed people. So, I don't get any valid applicants. Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to have to increase my wages. Another possibility is not hire anyone, but the economy is great. So I want to hire someone. I want to try to continue building my business. So I'm going to have to increase my wages. So wages are going to go up, okay? There's not many workers out there, and when there's not really many of things, whatever you're trying to buy, if there's not many of it, it's going to get expensive to buy that rare asset, okay? So even though the economy is good, the businesses are about to take a hit. Higher wages cause businesses to hire. All right, it's kind of confusing. Hire and hire. Make sure you use the terminology correctly when you're giving answers. I've already seen a couple people on the quiz use this term when they're talking about hiring workers. Okay, so higher wages cause businesses to hire fewer workers, leading to less production. I think I put that as the next step in the initial, and we're talking about recessionary gap. So let me do that here. So higher wages cause businesses to hire fewer workers. Fewer workers means less production. Okay. All right, so what happens is these businesses, they're all making good profits with the economy so strong, but when the wages goes up, their profit margins shrink, and some of them will actually turn negative. So some of those marginal businesses we're talking about before that maybe should go under will actually start to feel that strain, and maybe some of them will indeed fail. Okay? So fewer workers means less production. So short-run aggregate supply, which shows short-run production, decreases. All right, and let's imagine that this shift, don't if you're writing down notes, don't write this down, but let's imagine that short-run aggregate supply only shifts that far. Okay? Well, if it only shifts that far, we still have an inflationary gap. All right? We're still producing more than our potential. So you know what's going to happen if that occurs? Well, we'll just do it all over again. So short-run aggregate supply is just going to keep shifting until these effects go away. And at what point do they go away? They go away when we reach here, when we reach the long-run equilibrium. Okay? So this isn't magic that it shifts back to this perfect point. It's logic that causes it to do so. Okay? So if it shifts only a little bit, this mechanism is going to continue, and it's going to keep shifting until it gets to this point. What if it overshoots? What if it shifts too far? Well, then we got a recessionary gap, and the mechanisms we went through last time are going to work to shift it back towards the long-run equilibrium. So basically, at any point, see, the economy is calibrating towards that long-run equilibrium, because if it's to the left or to the right of that, it's going to bring it in, okay? These are going to work to steer the economy towards the long-run potential. So there's our short-run aggregate supply shift, again, to the perfect point, because eventually that will happen. And just the last thing that needs to happen here is that CPI needs to adjust, in this case, to a higher wage. So the CPI increases, and now our real GDP equals our natural, reaching the long-run equilibrium. Okay? All right, so our real GDP is going to fall. It's going to go to this level here. Kind of hard to show, but that's our new real GDP. So now we're at our full potential. And this is the way the classical economists saw it. A few things to point out here. You may be looking at this and saying, well, the workers, they're better off because of all this. Their wages went up, right? That's what you're seeing here. Yeah, their wages went up, but so did the CPI. So if prices go up as your wage goes up, maybe you're not better off. Maybe you're just exactly where you were before in real terms. Thinking back, a big picture now, we talked about those classical assumptions. You can see all of those assumptions here, or at least a few of them. One of the assumptions is prices need to be flexible. Where do we see that? Right here. CPI needs to increase. Okay, so prices need to be flexible for for this last step to be reached. Wages need to be flexible. Where do we see that? Right here. If wages aren't flexible, then these following steps can't occur. So that assumption is so crucial, that these wages must be flexible for this economy to fix itself. Interest rates needing to be flexible. We saw that in Say's law. You don't really see it so much up here. But you do see the last assumption that I suggested, the one that people make good choices and have, basically they're informed and make rational choices. You're kind of seeing that here in terms of the workers knowing, in this case, that they can ask for a raise. All right, understanding what's happening in the economy and using that information to their advantage. The business is understanding that if they can't hire anyone, they got to raise their wages. So this is where people are making those sort of predictable, rational choices. Okay? So those assumptions are so key, because if they don't work, this doesn't work. And what we're going to do in Chapter 10 is evaluate those assumptions and say, do they make sense? Yes or no? What we just covered is tough, all right? And you certainly should be reading the book for Chapter 9, as I've said before. Practice writing it out, all right? And I know if you're taking my summer class right now in 2018, you're taking these exams online and you're typing everything. I still think it would really help for you to write this out. Write the graphs, show the movements, go through these steps, make sure you know the steps, because it'll help so much on the exam. Because, I can write some tough questions, right? If you don't understand this, you're going to have trouble with those harder questions that happen on the exam. That's the end of Chapter 9. That's the end of classical economics.